Yeah, I'm standing by.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Balerion Space Ventures podcast. Today we have W. David Woods. David is an Apollo historian, author, and researcher. The Apollo program was probably the most ambitious and successful deep tech program in history, and David specializes in the technical details of Apollo. He answers not just what happened, but how it was done, and so his insights are highly relevant to us. He built the NASA-hosted Apollo Flight Journal, and he's written several books on the topic, including How Apollo Flew to the Moon, which is how I discovered him. So, David, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I think it would be good if I'd love to start big picture on the Apollo program and then drill down from there. But before we do that, could you just give a little of your background and how you got into this topic?
So I'm a child of Apollo. I was 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old when it all happened. I think that's a very impressionable age. And as luck would have it, that enchantment, I think of it as never left me. I just found it the most fascinating, audacious, inspiring thing that I could have imagined. I was kind of aware of it. And when the internet came along, I found that I was drilling into things, um, Usenet sites that talked about space and Apollo. And one of them led me to the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, which I still reckon is one of the great websites of all time. And this was, I couldn't believe what I'd found. It was a complete transcript of everything that happened on the moon during the Apollo program, with input from 10 of the 12 moonwalkers. So you were served with so much detail that it almost took you along with it. But what I missed was the flying to the moon and flying from the moon and being in orbit around the moon. And I kind of got to know the guy who made that website, and I eventually suggested that I create the Apollo Flight Journal as a companion to the Surface Journal. And I learned so much in compiling that that folks started suggesting you really ought to write a book. um, and so that's what happened. I happen to know there's a guy in Glasgow who's a very prolific and accomplished space author. And once I suggested to him that I write the book, he immediately put me in touch with his publisher, Springer, who's one of the big textbook publishers. And it was a very successful um, partnership.
Yeah, it really is an incredible piece of work. Uh, a lot of the audience here watched Artemis recently, and there are some similarities to Apollo. And I noticed, having seen your book, they brought up some of the same topics you did there in terms of anticipating where the moon is to catch its orbit and things like that. Um, but I still think it's not intuitive how this is pulled off. It's really tricky. You're not just flying there and landing like an airplane, flying across the country or something. Can you kind of give us a bird's eye view to start, or just an overview of how, how do you get to the moon and back?
Well, let's start off with how intuitive these things are, because if you have, like I live in Scotland, in the United Kingdom, and we do soccer, as you guys call it, football. And somebody who is trying to get a ball, from a free kick into the goal mouth isn't thinking in terms of mathematics or you know, drag physics and such. Like he just knows intuitively that if he hits the ball a certain way, it's going to fly, take a curve round, and go into the goal mouth. Um, or if you're someone who shoots a shotgun in order to hit grouse on a Scottish moor, then you know to lead in order uh, to to hit the bird. And so these are kind of intuitive ways that people get a grasp of how things move within our gravity field. And I think that flying to the moon is very much like that. So the first thing to grasp is if you throw a ball upwards at a flight angle, it will go up, slow down, and come back down. And it's very easy to extend that into the concept of an orbit, where you're throwing something all the way around the Earth. But in order to do so, you have to make it accelerate forward at 17,500 miles an hour or thereabouts. And you make it go a little bit faster, then you start to extend the orbit. And so going to the moon was very much like a stone throw. But you knew the moon was coming around in its orbit, and you led your aim such that you would not hit the moon, but you would be passing by very close to the moon. And you would then calculate to use its gravity to move you about in the way that suited your operational requirements.
That's a really intuitive way of putting it. So it's like throwing or kicking a ball, and just the same way you're anticipating where that person's going to be and trying to aim for that location so that it
Yeah,
arrives at the same time they
I,
do.
I see a lot of people who haven't got this stuff in their heads, and they talk about, well, they accelerated to 25,000 miles an hour. How come they slowed down? What's slowing them down? They're in space. They should keep going at that speed, and they forget about gravity. They forget about the idea that if you throw a ball upwards, it doesn't keep going at the same speed it started. It slows down, comes to a near halt, and then falls back down to you accelerating as it does. So you apply those mechanics to spaceflight, and you really do start to get it.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in your book. So it's not like the rocket just went and was just firing at full blast the whole time. It almost was like a throw the way you say, and then I don't want to say drifted, but it was kind of like that where it was set in motion like a ball,
I
and you
use
had
the
to
word
get
coast.
coast, right?
Yeah, you fire a powerful engine for 6 minutes, say, and then everything for the next 3 days until you get to the moon is just a pure coast, and it's just like a ball. After you throw it upwards, you throw it for a fraction of a second, and then it's coasting all the way up and it's coasting all the way back until it hits the
Okay.
ground.
But even with that, understanding that, I mean, when you go to orbit, you're going up 100 miles or something, but for the moon, it's 240,000 miles. And so do you need, are you needing a lot more push? And how much more do you need to get so that you can make it so you have enough momentum to coast to the moon?
Think of it again in terms of throwing something up. If you want it to go higher, you need to throw harder.
Yes.
And so instead of going up 100 miles, which was the typical starting orbit for Apollo, you then wanted to get to 240,000 miles, then you needed another very hard push. And that was the job of one of the stages of your launch vehicle to give you that final push to get you up to this higher speed, which allow you to go much higher away from Earth. You're trading speed and height. The higher you go, the more power you need, but you slow down as you go higher.
Okay. And so it goes up, and there's this giant rocket, and it has these multiple stages they use up their fuel, and then they drop off. And so what's left behind? Okay, you're pointing to your model rocket right there. Right. So
Yeah.
what's the final thing, the final projectile that's going out to the moon?
The final bit is the little conical bit at the very top. It's just that wee bit. It's just a cylinder, a cone, and a spidery lander. All in about 40 tons of weight. About the weight of a fully loaded articulated truck would be accelerated towards the moon. So it's a four-part spacecraft. It's two parts, and each part is in two parts. Two ticks. We like models.
Okay.
So this is your main mothership. You have this conical command module, which is where the crew would stay most of the time. You have a cylindrical service module with a big engine at the end. This is all your power, your propulsion, your source of air. And then on top of that, you have a lander.
Yeah, and that's just crazy. Like tinfoil and
it's not tinfoil. It's not tinfoil, and too many people think it is. What it is you have a pressure vessel. The bottom half is unpressurized. So what you've got there are thermal blankets. That foil-looking stuff is Captain, which is the outside layer, which is just there to part of providing thermal insulation. The two astronauts stayed in the top half, and the top half is a two-layer structure. There's a strong inner layer, which is there to provide a place, to hold their atmosphere. And then there's a thin outer layer, and that is there to deal with any micrometeorites. Because the idea is that if you have a 2-inch gap between a thin outer layer and a stronger inner layer, then the outer layer will dissipate the energy of a micrometeorite as it hits. And so the inner surface can better deal with the debris that comes from that. So the outer layer has a slightly flimsy look to it on that top section. If you look at the photographs, it doesn't look solid. It looks very thin, and it is very thin, but it's not the structure. The structure is an inch or two up underneath that. That's the pressure vessel underneath.
Okay. So you showed us kind of this whole thing. Ultimately, the projectile that's going into orbit of the moon is this last little rocket with a single thruster. There's a conical section on top, the command service module, CSM, where the astronauts are sitting, and then there's the lunar lander. And that whole package is what ultimately goes into the orbit of the moon?
That's correct. Exactly.
Okay. And so then what happens? They're orbiting the moon instead of the Earth.
Yep.
Okay.
So what they've done is that you can think of it as decelerating, but in another frame of reference, they're actually accelerating to match the moon's orbital speed around Earth. Because they don't do anything. They go round, the moon's gravity wheels them round and sends them back to Earth the way Artemis did. But if you add the energy to match your speed with the moon's speed, you can put yourself into orbit around the moon. The moon is traveling around Earth at very nearly exactly 1 kilometer per second, 0.6 of a mile, thereabouts. And so if you change your speed by that amount, you can put yourself into orbit. You obviously have to point your engines in the right direction to make the orbit exactly what you want. But that's essentially what you're doing, is you're matching the moon's orbital speed around Earth. So when you want to come home at the end of your mission, you then just put the brakes on and you stop from an Earth-centered viewpoint. The moon pulls away from underneath you and you fall back to Earth. But from the moon's perspective, you appear to be accelerating out of orbit.
Interesting.
But there's always different perspectives, and that's because the moon itself is moving around Earth. You've got lots of moving objects. You've got Earth and you've got the moon, and you're moving and such like. And each object has a different frame of reference.
So that's interesting. So that last little rocket that you showed, the reason why you have that is because you don't want to just slingshot and come straight back to Earth if you're looking to land on the moon. So you need to give yourself a little more energy so that you're staying orbiting around the moon for as long as you want to be operating up there.
Yep. Exactly.
Okay. And so then what? So now they've given themselves some energy. They're orbiting the moon. And then what do they do?
2 astronauts go into the lunar lander, the lunar module, and they separate from the command service module, and they basically head down to the surface. There's various techniques for doing that. So there was a more gentle way of doing it. Basically, the thing about Apollo was that as they gained operational experience, they refined their system. But essentially, once the 2 astronauts have separated, they fire their own engine at the bottom of the lander in order to get down to the moon. In Apollo 11, to take the simplest example, they fired the engine for a short period to drop their orbit. So when they go into orbit around the moon, in those days, they would go into an orbit that was 69 statute miles up, circular. The lunar module has to get out of that. So they would do a short burn, which would lower one side of their orbit down to about 9 nautical miles, thereabouts. 50,000 feet was the altitude they were looking for. When they then came around the opposite side of the moon, half an orbit later, they would then fire their big engine for a big, long 12.5-minute burn. And that would slow them down all the way such that they could land down on the surface in a nice, gentle hover.
Okay. And the moon gravity, it's 16.6% or something of Earth. And so is that help you?
1/6. 1/6.
1/6, right?
1/6. It helps you to the extent that you don't need as much rocket fuel as you would if it was a larger body. Where it doesn't, if you've got an atmosphere like you have on Earth and Mars, you have to negotiate an atmosphere, but the moon has, to all intents and purposes, no atmosphere. And so therefore everything has to be done using rocket thrust. And that's fine because that's very controllable.
Okay. And does that help you have a softer landing because you're not having to manage so much gravity?
It would. It helps you that you don't have to deal with atmosphere. Atmospheres
That's the real problem.
it can be a help and it can be a problem. It's a big help on Earth. It's a big problem on Mars because it doesn't have enough of it to really slow you down well. Whereas the moon, it's like it's not a problem at all. You just do everything with rocket thrust. And since rocket thrust is controllable, then that's got an advantage in that you can control it all the way.
So you don't have the atmosphere slowing you down, but you also have less gravity. So you kind of have the two things. Okay, interesting. Okay. Okay, and so then one person stays behind. Two are down in the CSM that lands on the moon.
No, the lunar module lands on the moon.
The lunar module, right.
The CSM is the mothership. It stays in orbit.
Right. So the lunar module lands with the two astronauts, and I mean, I actually have a lot of questions about that, but maybe I don't want to distract us from the first from the big picture first. But let's just say they land well, and they're at the right spot. How do they get back to the CSM?
So the lunar module, if you remember, I said is a two-part spacecraft. The bottom part is just purely for landing. It's got one big engine and it's got propellant tanks to feed that engine. There's nobody in there. It's not pressurized. There's the crew cabin is the top half. And if I can show you again, don't get reflections. The top half has got two bulges on either side, and those are fuel tanks, or propellant tanks would be the more accurate term. The propellant tanks are for its own engine. It has a small engine right in the center. And so when they've decided that they've done enough moon exploring, they pack up the sandwiches and get the computer to go. They press proceed on a one particular program, and that fires that engine. By this time, they've also fired pyrotechnic guillotines that separate the systems, cut the wires, cut the physical ties between the bottom half and the top half, so that when they fire that engine, off they go into the wide blue yonder. And the nice thing about lifting off from the moon is you don't have to do so much vertical ascent. On Earth, when you're launching, you have to do quite a lot of vertical ascent to get yourself out of the atmosphere. And then you can do the acceleration horizontally to get into orbit. Whereas with the moon, because there is no atmosphere, you pop off and almost immediately you pitch over and then start shooting yourself as fast as you can horizontally to get yourself into orbit.
Okay, so the top half pops off. You're leaving the bottom half behind.
Yeah, and they're still there. Yep. And you can see them in the photographs from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, and you can see all the tracks, the footprints, and the rover tracks all around about them still.
That's so cool. Yeah. It seems like it would be hard to aim. So now, it was one thing when you were talking about, aiming your projectile, to go into lunar orbit, but I don't know. It seems like when you're so far away and you're just with these little equipment, you've got the command service module orbiting, and you have to aim to make gentle contact with that again somehow.
Yeah. So you have two large-scale systems that are working in your favor. On board your spacecraft, you have a guidance platform, and that guidance platform has been aligned with respect to the stars. So it will hold its orientation with respect to the stars as the spacecraft can rotate about it. It not only measures direction of the spacecraft, aim, if you like, it also measures the acceleration. And since acceleration is a derivative of velocity, you can work back from acceleration to know what velocity you're doing. And you can also work back to work out what your position is. So because you've got this instrument, this guidance instrument, it's about the size of a basketball, sitting in the spacecraft, that's what allows you to get your aim right, because it knows to thousandths of a degree where its alignment is with respect to the stars. Your second important system, well, there's actually a third system, because not only are you measuring your position and your velocity, the Earth is measuring it as well, because they have a radio signal that has been beamed up to your spacecraft. The spacecraft is sending it back. And so on Earth, the engineers there can measure how that radio signal is changing. And that allows them to determine your position and your velocity as well. So you get a second solution from that. And then the other system that you have is that there's a radar system between you and the mothership. So at the very top of the lunar module, there's a radar dish. It's like a big eye at the top of the lunar module. And that's the rendezvous radar. And it's sending off to a transporter on the command service module, a transponder on the command service module. And so they get both angle and distance and the rate at which the distance is changing, range rate is what they call it.
So that's happening in real time as it's traveling?
That's happening in real time, okay. And the computers are taking that on board and working out what burns need to be done in order to effect an accurate rendezvous.
Okay, so it's not like you just have to kind of aim right and that's it. You get up there and you're constantly getting feedback to make sure you reach the CSM.
Yeah, and in fact, there was a fourth way, because they had charts with with lines on them, and you could put a chinograph mark in a window and measure an angle, and sight to your destination as a fourth backup. You had backup after backup after backup in order to do what was originally considered to be fiendishly difficult, but because it was studied and understood and practiced in Earth orbit with the Gemini program beforehand, it just became a procedure, something that could be practiced and refined and they got very, very good at it.
Yeah, those redundancies, in not just in that, but in other aspects of the mission, were an interesting part that you detail in your book. That's almost worth its own conversation. Okay, and so now this top half of the lunar lander is back connected to the CSM.
Yep.
And we're in lunar orbit, and so now now it's time to go home.
Well, the first thing you have to do is get all your samples, get the two astronauts and all their samples and all the bits that they want to keep, the film, whatever, get it out of the lunar module's ascent stage, get it into the command module, the conical bit, and jettison the ascent stage off the lunar module. Because the whole thing about trying to do that mission in those days was get rid of any mass that you don't need. Because the more mass you carry, the more propellant you need to accelerate it. They want to be as light as possible so that the big engine on the back of the service module doesn't have too much work to do. Okay. Apollo, you have to remember that Apollo was using very marginal systems. They could only just do it with a Saturn V rocket. And even with refinement, they got better at it as they went along. But it was still a low margin system. So you get rid of your lunar module as soon as you can. And so all that's coming home is that command service module.
Okay.
The big engine accelerates you out of lunar orbit and starts your big, long 240,000 mile fall to Earth.
And is that similar is it like a projectile where you're doing like an initial burn to kind of get you thrown, so to speak, back to Earth and then?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or the other way to think about it is you bring yourself to a stop with respect to Earth.
Right.
So that the moon slides out from underneath you and you start to fall back down to Earth. You can look at it either way. You're accelerating out of orbit around the moon, or you're bringing yourself to a relative stop with respect to Earth so you can fall down towards it.
So you're coasting / falling back to Earth.
You're totally falling back to Earth.
Okay. And at this point, you're still you're still two pieces. You have this conical section on the top, and you still have this little single stage rocket.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's more than just a rocket. I mean, it is full of propellant tanks and what have you, but it's a complete system for the spacecraft. You need everything that's in there for the 3 days of your fall. Because if you see around the side of it, it's got those are very similar to household radiators. That's all they are. Household radiators, in one sense. And it's the same thing up here. These are radiators for the electrical power system. So that's providing you with all your electrical power.
Okay.
And it's providing you with your air for breathing. It's providing you with your radio communication as well, to a large extent, because it's not shown here, but it had a big dish type antenna attached to the bottom of it. So it's very necessary. It's the conical part only has a life of about a few hours. Once that disconnects from here, it's running in batteries, it's running on a very small tank of oxygen, and that's your lot. So once this detaches, you better come home.
Okay. And so what point does that happen? So you're coming back with the 2 units, and at what point does that detach to come back to Earth? That top section.
About half an hour before you hit the atmosphere.
Okay. So you're back. Okay.
You have aimed your fall back to Earth such that you swing round the back of it and you're accelerating all the time, and you have aimed yourself to pass above the surface of the Earth at an altitude of about 25 miles.
Okay.
Now, the thing about doing that is that if you aim to swing around Earth at an altitude of 25 miles at your closest approach, you will hit the atmosphere. You have no choice. And so therefore you're going to start to decelerate. So what you do is, just before you hit that, you separate the two halves of the ship. They will both fall into the atmosphere. The service module will get burned up and destroyed. The command module has got a heat shield, and the heat shield protects it from the extremely hot temperatures. We're talking about 2,500 or more degrees Celsius, about 5,000 Fahrenheit. Very hot, but the design of that heat shield protects the crew and all the contents for the 5 or 10 minutes that they pass through the early parts of Earth's atmosphere.
Okay. And I think that's really the end of the journey, right? You're parachuting into the ocean, and you've completed this now?
Pretty much. There's very crucial things have to happen, because the parachutes are hidden away behind this cover.
Okay.
So that cover at the very top must jettison.
Okay.
And then once that's jettisoned, then you've got various pyrotechnics which fire to send out, first of all, drogue parachutes, which are designed to work at high speed, and they stabilize the spacecraft and slow it down to a speed that's slow enough that they can then deploy large, big orange and white parachutes that will plop it down into the sea. So a whole lot of systems have to work flawlessly, or near flawlessly, in order to get you onto the surface of the ocean in one piece. There was one notable failure on Apollo 15 when one of the big orange and white parachutes failed. Happily, there was redundancy in the system, and they could land quite safely under two parachutes. The third parachute was a safety factor that had been built into it.
Okay. And is there a big gap between just achieving this mission and achieving this mission in a way that's at least gentle enough so humans can survive it all? I could imagine coming back in that lander and some kind of spin getting set into place, or something that would be very difficult for a human to survive. I mean, how much of that is a component of all this design?
So when you say lander, you talk about the lunar module lander or landing
Well, I'd
back
say
on
the
Earth?
whole thing. I mean, it's hard enough just to do everything you just described, but you also have to do it in a way that a human could tolerate.
I think that's part of the reason why they use test pilots for the most part, is that these were folk who were used to dealing with very complicated procedures in highly agile, high-speed aircraft
Hmm.
and could deal with situational awareness and were happy to um, go through the procedures, and at the same time were already inured to high G
Okay.
forces that normal people, otherwise non-astronauts, would find rather difficult to deal with. So for for space flight at that level at that time, it was important to have people who could withstand not just the conditions in terms of the forces that are on the body, but also the procedures, the very complex procedures. Because what I think you have to remember is that this was 21st century exploration, but it was being carried out using 1960s technology.
Yeah.
And so the systems and procedures, in some cases, were very high tech, uh, but in other cases were unsophisticated. It's what they knew how to do at the time. It was enough to do it, but you needed very highly trained individuals who were used to high speed flight in order to carry that out.
I see. And how much was human input required? Could it theoretically do the whole thing without a human input and the humans were just backup, or did they have some critical plays that they had to be a part of?
They were doing an awful lot. Uh, the, it really was a huge team effort between the folk on the ground who were supplying information and helping with planning and keeping control of things that way, a bit like a very sophisticated air traffic control, and the people in the spacecraft who have the situational awarenesses and who are operating the stuff that's there based on a flight plan. And so at each stage of a mission, the team would kind of get together and decide, are we okay to go ahead with the next stage of it? And if they were go, it was up to the crew on board the spacecraft to carry out that next stage. But everybody's checking to make sure that everybody thinks that we're okay to go to the next stage of the mission. And this became the iconic go, no go calls where you still get it in space flight, that you'll get a flight director going around a mission control room and asking all the various consoles, are they go or no go? And
Hmm.
it's quite iconic. And it, goes back to the probably the Mercury days, but definitely the Gemini days, very much to Apollo. Um, Interestingly, when we talk about coming back to Earth and coming through the atmosphere, that flight, which was really quite sophisticated, because they were aiming for the ships, they knew a spot that they had to land. That was all controlled by computer.
Hmm.
Those guys weren't flying it. They could fly it if they had to. If the computer failed, they had backup plans that they could fly it manually, but it was all computer controlled. The the landing on the moon was also almost completely computer controlled. The astronaut only got to fly the lunar module in the very final stages where he was looking for somewhere smooth to land. And it so happened that um, purely by a fluke, the computer on Apollo 11 happened to be taking them to a very rough boulder field. The boulders were the size of cars or more. And so it was not a nice place to bring
Hmm.
down your ship. And so Armstrong, he then goes into that final program and he becomes part of a control loop. People tend to say, oh, the computer failed, and so Armstrong had to take manual control. And that's a bit of a stretch. He was just becoming part of the control loop. And every single landing, all six of them, the commander would take over the flying role for the last little bit while he found a smooth spot. It was designed that way.
Okay.
But the computer was absolutely necessary to do that landing from orbit right down to the surface
Okay. For on the moon side
on
and
the moon side
and on the Earth.
and on the Earth landing side. Well,
Right.
it could be done manually, but it was much easier just to let the computer do it for the Earth landing side.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it seems like to be able to do this. I mean, there somebody just says we're gonna do this. We're gonna go land on the moon, but it seems like you have to have some precursors in place to pull this off. And certainly the rocket is a big one. But I mean, it sounds like these navigation systems, these computer systems, are really maybe like the or one of the critical components.
Very much so. The Apollo guidance computer, of which there was two, one in the lunar module, one in the command service module. I would say, and I think a lot of people alongside me would say, that that is the granddaddy of all the computers that we're using now. It was the first use of integrated circuits, silicon chips,
Mm-hmm.
to build a small computing device. So the particular architecture that it had, we didn't follow that so much. But what it did was NASA ordered vast quantities of integrated circuits from the manufacturers, tested them to near destruction, and if they didn't work well, they sent them back. And they forced the companies to up their game. And so what they did was to seed the microelectronics industry from that point on, because they wanted these things to work. They didn't want them failing in space. So the quality control that NASA demanded seeded that whole industry.
And did they, I mean, at this point, did they have a reasonable idea of what they were going to encounter getting to the moon in terms of radiation and things like that? And, the stresses that would be put on the people and the systems?
So in the mid-60s, NASA had a series of unmanned probes to, first of all, go and take a close-up look at the moon. This was a range of probes. They did a suicidal dive down to the surface, and they were basically just TV cameras that were running right up until the last moment. And so from that, scientists could see that there were boulders sitting on the surface. And so they knew that the surface could hold the weight of something heavy. And then they had the surveyor probes, which were soft landers. Those soft landers, some of them had scientific instruments that could start to characterize the nature of the surface. And in particular, it determined that if you land on one of the dark splodges on the moon's surface, that what you're landing on is basalt. They're basically massive lava floodplains that solidified to basalt. And because those probes landed on a surface and they had TV cameras on top, and so they landed successfully and they could see out, they knew that the surface was strong enough to bear the weight of a large lander. And then the last of those three series was the lunar orbiter probes. And those were just basically spy cameras put into orbit. They had wide field cameras and narrow field cameras that could see objects down to a meter or two in size. And they were used to map out possible areas for the landing.
Okay.
So by the time they got the humans got to the surface, they knew a bit of, not the details, but they got a broad strokes of what the surface was like, and what to expect.
And it sounds like kind of into my next question, which would be, I mean, the guidance and navigation systems is one incredible, like you said, the granddaddy system to make this happen. But they also, I mean, they had to transmit this information across a huge distance. That seems like another novel accomplishment.
Yeah. At the same time as Apollo was happening, they were also starting to send probes to other planets, to Mars and such like. So the radio text, and they had already had the lunar orbiter probes being in orbit around the moon, and they were doing constant communication with that, with those probes. And so they knew how to communicate with the moon. They had very large antenna, up to 200 feet in diameter that could do this work. So they were certainly developing these techniques as the years went on, but they already knew how to do it in a basic sense. I got a question from a friend. Somebody she knows was watching the Artemis stuff, and how did they stream from the moon in 1969? Because the young folk think in terms of streaming, and streaming is a modern concept to do with digits and servers and such like. And no, it's just straight video on a microwave link. And when I had a career at the BBC, and one of the early things I used to do was set up microwave links If you wanted golf from St Andrews going to be transmitted on the main TV channel here, you got the signal out by using microwave links. You'd send to a hill, and then there'd be a van with 2 microwave dishes. And it's kind of similar to that there. The lunar rover, for example, had an inverted umbrella dish pointing at Earth, and there would be a huge antenna on Earth that is picking up the relatively weak signals from the moon, but it was enough to give us live television, not from the spacecraft, which is now 3 or 4 miles away, but from a little buggy that they took with them that has a most incredible interplanetary outside broadcast unit built into it. It is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, that really is amazing. Yeah, so when we kind of talked about the orbital mechanics of it, and then the navigation and guidance systems, and then these communication systems, and you'd mentioned, I mean, there's kind of two things. On the one hand, there was all this redundancy, and then you mentioned there's low margin. I mean, how is that balanced in terms of, those two things that seem kind of conflicting?
So I guess you design the system so that you've got sufficient redundancy. There are very, very few single point failures. But, for example, the lunar module, when it was first designed and, they built a prototype, it was far too heavy. And so they had a super weight improvement program, SWIP, where they tried to get engineers to trim off grams here, ounces there, and just to get the thing down to a weight that would fit into the capability of the Saturn V. Often the redundant, and another example is you design systems that have almost no weight. A beautiful example is that when they're coming in to land on the moon, how do they know where the computer is taking them? I mentioned earlier that the computer was taking Neil Armstrong into a boulder field.
Yeah.
How did he know that? He knew that because the computer was outputting a number, and he had lines painted onto the 2 panes in front of him. It was the same set of lines on an inner pane and an outer pane, and if he put his head in the right place, those lines would line up. And so he knew that he was in the right place for those numbers to make sense. So the numbers would come from Buzz Aldrin into his ear, 42, 41, 41, and he would look along the line that's painted on his window. That's where the computer's taking him. No weight. You've got a powerful system, and it had no weight penalty. Very, very clever sort of use of the systems that you've got. The big engine at the back here,
yes,
you might think that's a single point failure. It's really essentially 2 engines in one, because the only thing that was common is this combustion chamber. Everything else further up the chain is duplicated. It's got 2 control systems, 2 sets of plumbing, 2 sets of valves, and the propellants it uses, you don't need igniters for them. You just put them in, open the valves, they get squirted in, and off you go. There's no pumps involved. So you're making systems that are inherently reliable, plus you have the backups there. And yeah, it's clever design with a massive budget.
Yeah, that really is amazing. And I mean, do you have insight into this? Just the finance, was this just kind of an unlimited government program, or how did they have to, how did they have design financial constraints when they're doing this? Was that a big component of it, or was it all is it really all engineering, these technical challenges?
The way I see it is this was an act of the Cold War. And when a country faces what it thinks is an existential threat, it will mobilize the resources it needs to do something. And Kennedy set a time frame, to show that we are technically more advanced than them within the decade of the 1960s. And that unlocks the power of the purse from Congress, and Congress can cough up the money in order to make this happen. So in the 1964 federal budget, NASA was consuming 4% of that. which is a fabulous amount of money for a country the size of the United States, even at that time. It's far less than that now, of course. But so it was all about, yes, as much money as you need, get the people that you need. The money pays for the people and it pays for the material resources and such like, because it was decided that in order to show that the United States is superior to the Soviet Union, we are going to do this ahead of them. And it's all linked to threats of nuclear war and threats of who's got the more missiles and what have you. Because space technology and missile technology are very, very closely intertwined.
Right. I mean, you kind of start your book with that. You kind of go through that, how we got that original rocket to be able to do this. Yeah. Are there any other subtle technical details or any of your favorites or this that that we haven't hit in terms of the we've hit some of the key ones, but I'm trying to think if I missed any.
Well, the very important one is, what do you do with human waste?
What do you do with human waste? Okay.
What was the most common question that the astronauts got asked when they were out and about and doing their public affairs work? And it was, how do you go to the bathroom in space? Yeah. And it is just, it's gross. It's quite frankly gross. What we would call number ones, urine went into a tank. It would eventually be vented overboard. And the joke around that is that when the liquid goes out of the spacecraft through a nozzle and it hits the vacuum of space, it very quickly evaporates, so quickly that the core of it forms an ice crystal. And so you would have ice crystals of urine gently floating away from the spacecraft, which get in the way of the stars. So if you're trying to navigate with the stars, you better not do it when there's a constellation Orion floating around the spacecraft at that time. You had to wait until it dissipates. The really gross one is for pieces, which is no more than a plastic bag. A plastic bag with an adhesive flange. And so the astronauts described that you basically just got naked, you got down into the lower equipment bay of the spacecraft, and you do this awful business. And there are parts of the transcripts where, in Apollo 10, where one of the crew mentions that there's a wee bit of brown stuff floating by, and someone says, well, that's not mine. So it's pretty horrendous. There's another story that when the frogmen opened the door to one of the spacecraft, they slammed it shut again very quickly because it stank so much.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
It was, by all accounts, pretty gross. And so it's good that Artemis has a proper toilet.
Yeah.
If you're going to take humans a long way in space, you better, a primary system is the toilet.
Yeah, that's probably going to be right. It's got to be one of the first things you make sure you've got right.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is interesting. And then I guess we're the one thing I wanted to ask you about the moon, and you were kind of alluding to it with this boulder field, but I'm not sure people recognize the terrain of the moon and the types of like altitude changes that can be like as big as Mount Everest, and that seems extremely challenging to be able to land in the right place and to be in a safe place where you're not going to be on an edge or something, and then to be able to navigate in that kind of a terrain. I mean, how much of that was a technical difficulty in terms of managing actually being on the moon and functioning on the moon?
Well, navigating to the moon, they had it pretty well tied down because they had a clever system whereby they could use the navigation instruments on board the spacecraft, particularly on board the CSM, to take marks on known features on the moon's surface. And that allowed the computers to be able to navigate to precise points, within a few meters of where they wanted to go. What they found when they got there was that for the most part, you have this cratered, hummocky, rough up and down, but you could drive on it. If you had a car, which they did on 3 of the missions, And if the car was designed properly to deal with the boulders and such, like small boulders, you could drive around it, avoid the big stuff, and get about. The interesting thing was that before we landed on the moon, the assumption by so many, including NASA's artists, was that the surface of the moon would be all jaggy rocks, jaggy cliffs, and the mountains would be jaggy. And when they went there, what they found was that everything is rounded off, because the moon is an extremely ancient surface, or has an extremely ancient surface, because it is being bombarded with micrometeorites all the time, a constant rain of dust and slightly larger rocks, and maybe the occasional very large rock, but for the most part, everything has been ground down. So if you leave a fresh rock out on the surface, come back after a few million years, you will find the top of it has been eroded away, and there's a pile of dust sitting up along the bottom. So all the mountains have been rounded off and eroded away.
Okay.
One of the most amazing landing sites was for Apollo 15, where it landed next to a 3.5 billion year old lava channel, a mile wide and about 300 or 400 yards deep. And over in the distance, there's a lump, a hill, a mountain. And you look at it, and I do this all the time. I say to people, how high is that? And they look at it and they go, a few hundred feet, whatever. And it's 14.5, 15,000 feet off the plane. But and it's rounded off, and there's no sense of distance. There's no atmosphere fading things off into the distance. There's no snow line. There's no tree line. There's no houses. There's no reference to tell you how big that mountain is. And it's all rounded off. When it was created 4 billion years ago, it was basically thrust up within a matter of minutes by a massive impact that was a few hundred miles away, because it's at the very edge of a huge impact basin. So it's a crustal block that has been forced up. It would have been jaggy 4 billion years ago, I'll bet you, but it's now been ground down, and it's all this incredibly rounded, dust-covered edifice sitting 14,500 feet high off the plane.
Oh, it's hard to conceive of. That's amazing. I think I could ask you 6 hours more questions.
I'm here.
I think what we've gotten through is it's been a quick hour, and really, I think you've given us incredible architecture, a taste of what it is, but there's so much more depth, and I think that's really what your products have to offer. And we have a lot of people that are working on operating on the moon now, and with rovers and power and navigation and all the things that you've described. And I think that your resources and background are just going to be an incredible. That this is when it was done before, and you've documented it. So it's an amazing gift, and I really appreciate you being on here today.
I'll finish up with one point, because one of the most important rocks that was found was during Apollo 15, when they found a type of rock called anorthosite. And that anorthosite is part of a story that tells you what the creation story is for Earth. And I think that is the greatest prize. I happen to have a piece of anorthosite here. This is Scottish.
Could you spell that for us?
Anorthosite, Anorth, and or.
Okay, now I got anorthosite. I see. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. It's a rock that tells you a little bit about how the moon was formed, and that tells a story how Earth was formed. And for me, the most important thing that came from Apollo was our creation story.
Okay. And the anorthosite is it. And what's the link?
So the link is that anorthosite is an igneous rock. It forms within magma.
Yep.
And it's rich in aluminium, so because that's a light element, it floats to the surface.
Okay.
And so the fact that they found it on the moon tells you that at some point there was a very large amount of magma on the moon. Something had to cause that magma to be melted. And the story that eventually came out of that is the idea that two planets collided in the very early days of the solar system. The products of that collision are Earth and the moon.
I see.
The moon is part of the Earth. It's part of the Earth and this other planet, which we call fear. Um, so that to me is the whole of planetary science. The bedrock of planetary science is what the Apollo astronauts did.
Yeah, it's an amazing
It's
contribution.
it's fabulous stuff, and it's
Yeah,
way beyond the geopolitical
yeah,
motivation for the missions, in my opinion.
that's a great point. And a great story. Uh, so a northosite.
An opposite.
Let's look that up. So, well, this has been excellent, David. Thank you so much for joining us. Incredibly educational, and I hope it's a taste that entices people to read your books and look at the NASA Flight Journal.
Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.